We're on page 108. We read the whole section last week, but we didn't get finished sort of looking at it, investigating it. So just to maybe go through it and then focus on a couple of passages. So looking at this, the first line, the statement of there's nothing real or solid about anything, don't view anything as true. True here means as above, real and solid. This is not a true and false, it just means as self-existing. And then if you regard anything as real and true, substantial and self-existing, then this is just a view, it's a projection, a fantasy. It doesn't accord with how things really are. So you're imposing a wish driven by kind of desire and misunderstanding and considering it real. This is part of the meaning here. It also means, it doesn't mean that things don't exist. You could misread this passage and say he's making some sort of nihilistic statement that nothing exists. He's not saying that anything doesn't exist. He says it exists in a conditioned way. All things that appear to be are supported by causes and conditions that are ever shifting in flux. And that's where the Vajra Sutra line comes from. So you see them as dreams, illusions, bubbles, and shadows. It doesn't mean that dreams, illusions, bubbles, and shadows don't exist, but they don't have any real substantial nature to them. It also means, there's many levels of what it could mean, but it also means that although things are that way, they seem that way, they come and go, it's also talking about seeing things in true and real through a mind or a consciousness that is still caught up in conditions and still caught up in what the text would say, drunken dreaming. And so in the state of drunken dreaming, where we are looking at things and projecting onto things our emotional and intellectual ideas, opinions, desires, fantasies, what we see is actually not things as they really are, but things as we imagine them to be, or fear them to be, or we don't see them at all. This is another aspect of it, and this is called selective perception. And this is something that neuropsychologists have been aware of for a long time, so this is not necessarily a unique Buddhist view, that at any time, in any one moment, we only see, hear, smell, have consciousness of a very limited sphere or range of what's going on around us at any time. This is something that's so obvious, we don't want to dwell on it, but most of the time, things that are so obvious sort of elude us too. And so instead of being conscious of this, we really do start to believe that the field of our perception and understanding is the full scope of what things are. This is reality. And so in a sense, we live in cognitive silos without knowing it. And each of us is looking through, everybody know what a silo is? Sorry, I use a silo. In the Midwest where I grew up, there were these big tall pagodas on farms, but they're called silos, and they're round. They're about half the circumference, say, of this room. They can go up 40, 50, 60 feet, and that's where grain is stored. Usually grain is stored in there, so there's a hole in the silo and the grain's put in, and the grain's taken. So it's a storage facility like a tower. That's why I was joking. They're not pagodas. They're agricultural pagodas in a sense. So that when you see a standard farm, you'll see the barn, the houses, the fields, and then you'll see this tall structure usually going up. Sometimes it's made of, the modern ones are made probably of aluminum and even fiberglass, but in my time they were wood and stone. And often if the farm burned down, the silo would be the last thing standing because it wouldn't burn down. Now the danger with silos is we weren't allowed to play in them when we were kids, although it was really tempting because there's you crawl up the side of the silo on the ladder and you can get pretty high, and you can, in a flatland like where I grew up, you could see forever, and it was wonderful. And also you escaped chores because nobody could find you. But the danger was if you got into the silo, it's really hard to get out again. And people die in silos because once they get in, say with corn or grain, they can sink down. And once they sink down, it's worse. It's like drowning. And so it's a dangerous place, and we weren't allowed to play there as kids. So, but a silo, when you're inside a silo, I'm just extending this, all you see is the inside of the silo. And sometimes when the silo is open to put grain in, you see out through the silo up. But that's all you see. So it's a wonderful insular kind of space, but it's also self-limiting. And if you lived in a silo long enough, you would probably, be like Zhuangzi's frog at the bottom of the well, think that that was the entire universe. So now, how did I get into silos? There was something about, we can create, and this is what's called conditioned existence. Conditioned existence is not simply because we have causes and conditions working on us, defining us, and holding us into our existence, literally, physically, and mentally, emotionally. But conditioned in the sense that we only see through those conditions. And so what we're seeing or hearing at any one time can be silo-like. This is another way of looking at the opposite of the awakened mind, which is said to be broad, expansive. The silo mind is a collapsed awareness, a collapsed cognitive state that we only... And in some ways it can be very comforting and comfortable, because it reduces down a lot of variables, and a lot of other people's ideas and views, and even people themselves can disappear in a silo. And so consciousness becomes constricted and small, but at the same time it's an artificial reduction. So that's why something like the Avatamsaka, if you're familiar with that sutra, or even better is chapter 39, the Gandavyuha chapter, which is called Entering the Dharma Realm. It's a series of little Sudana, I say little, pure use Sudana, going from one teacher to another, seeking to understand what it means to be a bodhisattva and how he awakens. And with each teacher, his consciousness starts to expand and expand and expand. And it's called the unbound, liberated, unattached mind. And so consciousness, and that's why it's called entering the Dharma realm, because as he leaves the silo, so to speak, of conditioned existence, he enters the full nature of reality. And his mind continually and his consciousness continually expands until there's this wonderful, I'm trying to think where it is. Where's the tower? Manjushri's tower. It's towards the end, right? Maitreya's tower. Which is like a silo, but it's the reverse. Inside Maitreya's tower, he enters into the Avatamsaka, totally expanded, liberated consciousness, and there's a description in there. Poetically and I would say psychoactively, it's just a beautiful, mind-blowing description. You can get lost. We've chanted it in classes, and you just become absorbed. But it's describing that unbound, liberated mind that has, in a sense, left the silo. So that's one way to start looking at this passage when he talks about true and real. And then this applies to the next line where he's talking about false and true. He's not saying this in sort of some moralistic or even philosophical true or false, but he's talking about it in the sense of true and false as it's used in this text. And I would argue throughout that true and falseness has to do with being in the center of reality, as in other words, being in Dharma and being aware and conscious of things as they truly are. free from those projections and free from those attachments. So this is basically talking about the awakened mind. But the awakened mind means right now within our ordinary situation, we really are aware and seeing things as they truly are and not living in projections or habits or so forth. So to give you an example, and make this stronger, sometimes I prefer to use centered and off-centered, or aligned and misaligned. And so the true is aligned, it's centered. And the false is being off-centered, being misaligned. It's not necessarily having the right philosophical or even religious opinion or idea, but it's rather having your life sort of unattached, unbound, freely moving, aware yet not grasping or anything. This kind of centering that's talked about. Give you a passage here. Let's just look. I was looking at page, say, 69 and 70, where I think he gives a description sort of this. In this section, he's talking about a disciple who asked about the Lotus Sutra and the one great matter. And he says the one great matter is just becoming awake, becoming aware, opening your mind and open to your full potential of Buddhahood. And then by contrast, that's the true. By contrast, the false is, and that's at the bottom. And so his sense of true is you should, I'm quoting now, you should now believe that the knowledge and vision, what a Buddha knows and sees, what an awakened being knows and sees, is just your own mind. There is no other Buddha. So this true and false then is coming to be described as the Buddha of your own aware, Buddha of your own mind, opened up and free. And then by contrast, what is false goes on in the bottom of 69. It's only because living beings, in other words, those who aren't accessing this full capacity, cover over their own light with lust and craving for sensory experiences, become enslaved to things outside and disturbed within, that the world honor one is roused from his samadhi to exhort them to cease and not to seek outside themselves, instead realize that they are the same as the Buddha. This is called realizing the Buddha's knowledge and vision. And then, so here again, the contrast, it's not so much it's almost behavioral. It's almost like how to be in the core of clear seeing. And then he says, I too always exhort people to realize, to make real the knowledge and vision within their own minds. And then he goes again and describes what the false would be. Ordinary people are perverse, confused, and deluded. They do wrong. So again, you get the sense here that wrong isn't because they're bad. It's because there's confusion, which was what Socrates' view of was also on people doing wrong. It wasn't because they were ill-intentioned. It's because, from his point of view, it was ignorance. Ignorance was the root of misdoing. Their talk may be good, but their minds are bad. Now you're getting into the behavioral of false. Greedy, hateful, envious, fawning, and flattering. Now, of course, this was talking about people in the Tang Dynasty, and it's hard to imagine why that would be applying to us today, but there might be some carryover. Deceitful and arrogant, take advantage of others and harm living creatures. These are all behavioral descriptions of something that is off, misaligned, and wrong. Thus, they only realize the knowledge and vision of living beings. So this is just, there's many passages like this in the text, but I want to describe it. It has to do with a kind of right-on functioning, and then when the wrong is you're not functioning, you're not centered, you're not reading off the true core, the true nature. And so coming from this essential nature, undisturbed, really clear, is true, balanced, centered, and the opposite. And this is something then through your whole mind-body nexus. It's not like intellectually you think I'm right and I'm true, and you think this is wrong or false. But you intellectually know it, you emotionally know it, you viscerally know it. It resonates through your whole being. And this has to do with this total functioning. Anyhow, so then we go on. The next passage has to do with, and this is interesting because I think the title of the verse has to do, true, false, motion, and stillness verse. So we've just done the true, false sort of thing, and then motion and stillness. And now he seems to be going into what he calls the single mark, Ishang Sanmei, the single mark samadhi, or sometimes alternately, equally calls it the single practice, Yixing Sanmei, single practice samadhi. And what he's talking about here is that when you are in the true, when you are centered in this way, then 24/7, walking, standing, sitting, lying down, you are balanced and centered. You are totally responding to things as they are and responding appropriately and not creating unwholesome karma through your actions. So here he's kind of saying it's not something you just get from meditation. It's not like saying, okay and I'm centered, I'm true in my mind when I'm sitting in meditation, but then when I'm moving about at work, in the family, and so on and so forth, things go awry. What he's saying here, he says, sentient beings move about, insentient things are immobile. If you cultivate a practice of immobility, you will be like sentient things frozen. So what he's saying here is, you have to be living, engaged in the fullness of your conditions of your life, at the same time, not be thrown off by them, not lose your center. So in the midst of activities, it's as if you're, quote, meditating, because you're centered, clear, and have equanimity and responsiveness. He says, if you shut it off, this is to go back into now, it's a contemplative silo. It's a meditative silo. You've gone into a silo of reduced consciousness, reduced awareness, and think that you have now escaped sort of conditions and not being caught up in appearances. So he's warning against the practice of immobility. In another part of the text, he says, sitting in meditation isn't what I mean by meditation. My meditation is sitting, standing, walking, even in sleep. You are unmoving, you are centered, you're aware. And he says the opposite is frozen. And frozen is a really good rendering of a kind of false samadhi that has to do with the shutting down of sensibility rather than the heightening and centering of sensibility. And then he says, if you seek true stillness, and this is very interesting, it is movement in stillness. So here's again a cautionary tale or warning about the stillness you seek is not a stillness that is pulled away or a sensory deprivation, but rather it's right in the movement of conditions that you have the stillness. So it has to be a stillness that comes from awareness and not a stillness that comes from withdrawal or shutting down. And that stillness can only be still if there's no attaching and grasping or seeking going on. So this is very tricky because it's like we sit in meditation as a practice to watch the mind and see how it moves. But the real test of the meditation is to see what happens in all other deportments and all other activities. Can the unattached, unbound equanimity apply universally? This is the movement in stillness. He says, not moving immobilizes and deadens, and insentient things lack that stimulating germ of Buddhahood. Buddhahood comes from the awakening and expanding of the consciousness, not from insentience, immobilizing, and going into oblivion. So this is very difficult because it means that your whole life has to be meditation. I'm sorry. So I know this is called a meditation class, but it's really kind of misleading because you're not learning how to meditate here. And it's not me. The text is saying if you really want to meditate, there's no place that isn't the way place, and there's no time that isn't meditation. And to be properly meditating, it's all the time, in every situation. Thought after thought, he says. That's what meditation is. Okay. Then this next part is really very tricky too, I think, because it's both formal and colloquial. Skillfully discerning amid all appearances, yet not being turned by them, is the cardinal meaning. The ability to discern in this way is itself the true nature at work. Key words here for me are discernment. And discernment has to do with a penetrating recognition that isn't biased or isn't sort of narrowly subjective. It's a combination of both having your cultivated person centered, but also it's using texts as well as sort of checking and balancing to your own perceptions. So it's a cultivated state that goes between checking out principles as they come through texts that we can rely on, at the same time listening to yourself and observing the situation, and then checking back and forth. After a while, the texts say, and this is said even in the Confucian tradition, after a while of cultivating this way where you are attuning your mind and body and emotions to things as they really are, they say attuned to the Tao or the way, and you have studied extensively so that you see the correlation between those two, it becomes a second nature. It becomes automatic. It becomes very natural. And you don't have to calculate and kind of do an analysis after a while, because your attunement is just so naturally, harmoniously in line that without thinking, your first impulse, your first response is right on. And this is a famous passage in the Confucian text where Confucius says he started at 15, but it wasn't until he was 70 that he could trust his impulses, his first readings, and not step off the way. And so it's a kind of acquired new nature. Yeah.
Discernment also, I think, has it's also in reading the context, and sometimes it's also in a nuanced context. So it's also the
Say more.
kind of condition. It's being aware of the conditioned reality when one is in all of its complexity.
Discernment, yeah. Discernment, in a sense, is aware of context, and it's in every situation you're penetrating through. You're seeing what's there, but at the same time, you're seeing what it represents.
So it's not just awareness of the inward, but it's also.
Oh yeah. In fact, when it says everywhere engaged and nowhere attached, is what he's talking about here. The everywhere engaged means it's inward and outward. You're everywhere engaged. You're aware of what's going on within, and you're also aware of what's going on without. If you are setting up nowhere within, no desires, expectations, fears, or whatnot, you're really just looking at things as they really are, then when you encounter something outside, like say someone's anger, you discern and see where it's actually coming from. It may feel like it's directed at you, but in fact, if you don't have any of those hooks and edges, you can actually see that it seems to be directed at you, but really it's coming from a suffering in that person themselves and not about you. Same thing about love. Some seems to love you, but in fact, it's not really about you. It's about an unfulfilled urge or desire that they have that's being projected. And so discernment has to be, it's both cool and bright. It's cool and bright, but it's not inhuman, it's not cold. But cool in the sense that it's not heated up by passions, too many passions. And bright in that it really shines light. The thing I think about is, I was thinking too, when I was a kid, I went to this romantic movie with my sister. She dragged me to this romantic movie. I won't tell you what it was. Most of you wouldn't even know it. It was romantic in the 50s and 60s. It's not like romantic now. It's pretty tame. But in the middle of that, she lost discernment. And so, I don't know how else to put it. I lost discernment in other kinds of movies. That movie, I didn't learn discernment. And so when the men and women kiss and embrace, I go, oh, yeah. And, she was just like, oh, and the tears, and and so the movie was going on, and she was really caught up on it. See, the movie starts, the lights go down, there's music, and then you're just you and the screen, the silo, the sensory silo. And then all of a sudden, these are the old-fashioned movie theaters, right at that moment when he's going to say to her, you are, and the music's building, the reel breaks. Because these were reels. They ran reel to reel, and I was just, and the thing burns on the screen, and then they flip on the lights, and the manager comes out. Please be patient. We'll get back. And her whole world collapsed. And it was like the lights came on the film. That's discernment. So when discernment comes, it's not always necessarily like the movie. It can be the opposite. And so when those lights come on at some moment, wherever it is, there's this feeling that you cut through the fog and the sort of constructed passion that goes with a movie theater. Anyhow, something like that. Yeah, for me, see, when the movie and everything came out, I was like, okay, this is real. And you look around and, but for her, what was real was the escape from that. Anyhow. Okay, skillfully discerning. So appearances have to do with sort of just seeing the surface of things like the cosmetics and being moved by those. Either there can be appearances, can be just literally sight, but it also can be appearances of sound and smell and taste and tangibles. And so it applies to all the faculties, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Appearances can be as they manifest without discernment, and as they manifest through projection. So they can be both ways. We're projecting something that isn't there, and that's appearances, but we're also just taking the surface read of it and without penetrating through, like being in a movie. I'll give you an example. And so, but at a deeper level, this is talking about something, the Chinese is, what's the tone? Is it xiang or xiang? Fourth tone? Xiang. And literally, it's really hard to translate, but because it has so many layers. It has a philosophical layer, but it has a psychological and emotional layer. But it means something that has a mark or a characteristic about it. Sometimes it's laksana or nimitta is another words that are used for it. And there's different ways of talking about it. So this is a little technical, but it's kind of interesting. One way of talking about it is there's said to be 4 marks or characteristics of all phenomena, all conditioned things. And then they're rendered differently. Some render it as birth, being the first, coming, or sometimes that's rendered as coming into being. And then there is what's called dwelling or being. So birth, being, or dwelling is the next stage. So something comes into being. There's a period where it seems to abide. That's the second mark. The third mark is that there's change or decay or erosion of this, and or decline, and then finally death. So sometimes it's birth, being, change, decay, death, or birth, life, aging, death, or initiation, continuation, change, and cessation. There's different ways that people represent these, what are called the 4 nimitta, or 4 marks. And then it's said that discernment has to do with seeing this in all phenomena. And so part of this has to do with if we're not aware of these 4 stages or 4 marks of conditioned things, we start to take them for something they are not. So part of the problem with being caught up in appearances, where he says you lose the discernment, is you're not aware anymore of these things. You're not aware that everything is going through or in a phase right now. In ourselves, each of us is in a phase. In the room, you came in, there was an initiation. You left something that was decay, death out there, whatever that was. You came in here, there's an initiation, you're in a new space. As you sit, you enter a sort of state of, abiding, dwelling, and whatnot. And as you start to get tired and bored with what I'm saying, there's a period of decline, change, and decay and deterioration. And finally, you fall asleep and it's over. Or you go back out, and the cessation of this, and then something else begins out there. So it's sort of like within a cycle of an hour and a half, these four things happen. But even as you're sitting here now, in your body, in a microscopic or metabolic way, there is simultaneously four stages going on simultaneously at different things. Cells are coming into being as we're here. Cells are sort of maturing while we're here. Some cells are decaying. I won't say which ones, but brain or otherwise. And then some are just gone. They're dying. There's funerals going on, and you got your head, and all of a sudden the flakes come off, and those are the dead cells. Okay, so at the micro level that's going on, in a social level that's going on, and as we sit here, we're part of a process of galaxies and planets and systems that are also simultaneously, some coming in. What do they call it? Birth of stars or new stars? And then there's this where they dwell for a while, like our sun's in a sort of dwelling, but it's also decaying. And then there's planets that go out, and there's black holes, and then it starts all over again. So what awakening has to do with, or discernment, what he talks about appearances, is not losing this consciousness. Not losing this consciousness. It's very easy to lose. It's very easy to lose and to not see things as in a continuous process of these four marks. And I can't think of... Okay, everybody exhale. Blow out so there's no breath left in your lungs. Okay, now the air comes in, initiation. It reaches its fullness, maturity, and it starts to go out, decay, change, and then it's gone. And now another one. So just in the breath process, and if you're using breathing as part of your meditation technique, you can contemplate the four marks. You're never apart from them. Each breath, you're going through that. And you could even do this. It's sort of like the first initiation, inhale, it's spring. The fullness of breath is summer. As you start to exhale, it's fall. And when it's gone, it's winter. And then spring. So you just watch the daily, the sun seems to rise. So you have initiation. Midday, noon, it's in its fullness. It starts to seemingly go, but it's really the earth. I just want to be clear. Everybody understands it's the earth that's moving. Okay. And then nighttime. And then you think, oh, that's over? No. And then it comes back again. Spring, summer, fall, winter. Watch the moon, the phases of the moon. There's a waxing, a peak called the full moon, and a waning. And it goes on. So there's nothing that in our conditioned that escapes us. And being aware of this then can lead to a liberation of consciousness, because you situate yourself in a continual flux and change of conditions, inside, without, and where is it you're going to set up? So this is the other part of discernment of appearances. It's very complicated. You can have this awareness, but at the other hand, you can also attach to a mark. And then you go wrong too. For example, psychologically, emotionally, even physically, you attach to the first mark, initiation, birth, coming into being. And all your energy and all your attention goes into the creation, the life force, the bringing of the new. And you're completely into innovative, radical new things in terms of the clothes you have, the computers you buy, the words that you're using, the books you read. Oh, new, breathtaking, and you're just constantly caught up in the first mark. And so that becomes the fondness for that then becomes attached to an appearance of the fear of it not being new. So then you get caught. See, and then you can get attached to the second mark, and the second mark has to do with abiding dwelling. And there you don't want change. You want stability. You want permanence. And so you get into a kind of attachment to abiding and dwelling, which is a sort of kind of quest for immortality, of security, stability, conserving what is and not letting it slip away. And so by attaching to that one mark, getting caught in that one appearance, then your life starts to go around that. And of course, then the fear associated with that is change. Anything that's in the first mark, new or whatnot, becomes a threat to the second mark. And so you can see how you set up in the second. The third mark you can set up is you get to having an aversion of fear to change, to decay, to things going bad. And so then you try to resist that. Or you get a kind of, how should I say it, a sadness, a kind of melancholy for things that are passing. And you can see this in poets. Many of Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, have to do with a kind of hanging on the third mark. Anybody know the sonnets? Anybody know Shakespeare? Shakespeare's sonnets? Okay. A lot of Shakespeare's sonnets have to do with this reflection on the passing of things that one loves. The one I just, it starts, when I behold by time's fell hand to face the rich proud cost of our warm buried age, when I sometimes see lofty towers down raised or brass eternal slave to mortal rage. He goes on and talking about passing everything, and he says, and he ends the poem by saying, this thought has taught me to ruminate, to really think that everything I love will be taken away. And so it's in the third mark, and he says it becomes a death which cannot choose but weep to have that which it fears to lose. And so what he's doing, what he's doing in these sonnets is getting into the third mark and hanging in there. And then becomes this, everything's passing, nothing stays. And you become kind of depressed in this way. And then, of course, the fourth mark, getting attached to that, is sort of like a backward-looking nostalgia, so that everything that in your consciousness is gone. Everything you value is gone. And so you're constantly living in memories and things of past things, but you're attaching to that fourth mark. And so I'm just saying you can go through this. You can go through this in many ways. That's just one rendering of the four marks. There's another rendering that has to do. Anybody know the other standard list?
Is it suffering, impermanence, no self, and...
No, not this. Those are also seals, but that's not. Those are called Dharma seals or marks. The other list is sometimes rendered as self, others, living beings, lifespan. Mm-hmm. This is one that's used. And what it means, the best understanding I got is the first one is called a mark or a view of self, that there is a real self in the five skandhas. That these five skandhas of form and feelings and consciousness and so forth, there's a real eternal self in there. That's the view of self. The second one, that the self or I or personality is different from other beings. So that's the others. That others have this self and I myself, and they're two distinct things. The third one is that that living beings have a self that's born of the skandhas. And the fourth one is that this self has a fated or limited lifespan. So these are called four marks also. This is also a four marks thing. But all of these turn on this idea of a permanent, unchanging core self, which, according to the text, and I would say according to science, is nowhere to be found. Nonetheless, we look for it, we create it, we cling to it, we try to hold it together against all processes, and it doesn't stay. So this is another way of looking at the four marks, getting caught up in those. It's a little technical. Any questions on this? Fast sledding? Yes?
So for the third mark, you're talking about how people get attached to kind of things decaying. It seems like also then, like it can be easy to interpret Buddhism to be about that. So how do you differentiate
So when you're using these as contemplations, for example, he has this line where he says, if you attach to appearances wherever you are, and if you do not attach to appearances and do not become attracted or averse to them, neither grasping or rejecting, untroubled by all of this, that's where you want to be. But it doesn't mean you're not aware of it. And there's this one line, outwardly be unattached to appearances right in the middle of them, and inwardly be empty without clinging to emptiness. So to answer your question is, if you take them to be real and true and permanent, you will miss the mark and you will suffer. If, on the other hand, you fall into a kind of emptiness and totally negate them, deny them, get morose about it, you fall into an emptiness. And so, as often with the middle way, there's a sense of a balance between seeing them this way, but then at the same time not falling into an emptiness regarding them. And that's why it says the true emptiness, which is the seeing of it as it really is wondrous existence. It's not dull, suicidal, depressive. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think sometimes people too, they have like a joy in the like, I feel like there's also kind of people, there's like something sweet about the decay of things that people.
Mean to the actual decay of things or something sweet? Or to dwelling on the decaying?
Well, dwelling on it.
Yeah, it's a poetic poetic melody.
It's not like totally negative and dark. There's something kind of like, there's something joyous about it sometimes for people.
Yeah.
Appreciation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, appreciation for it is one thing. For example, again, if I go back to the farm, if things never decayed, then there wouldn't be the cycles and there wouldn't be the joy of spring that would come with. So with fall comes the harvest, then comes the resting period of winter, then comes spring again. So there's a joy in each one. But that's seeing the full cycle of things. But if you attach to the third, then you get into a kind of attached, how should I say, a beautiful indifference, which is actually a kind of malady. And so what you're doing is you're just sort of dwelling, but then what happens is it becomes an identity. It becomes a kind of characteristic of your personality, and in a sense it's a setting up. And by setting up, you then are not aware of the others. And so it's a very kind of interesting attachment, but not necessarily a burning, painful one. But yet it does keep you immune in certain ways from other things. So it's very careful. It's sort of like meditation can become this as well. Your meditation practice can become in a kind of an immunity of pulling away from certain things that you don't like or don't want to deal with. And then it feels okay because it's Buddhist. I'm meditating and I'm doing a Buddhist thing here. Or I'm sort of just seeing the emptiness of everything, and that's Buddhist. But if you read the text and you read like Sutta, you don't see like, man, it's like French existentialism where you're just sipping coffee and like, wow, it's like all going downhill. It just so sucks. And, there's no meaning. And, that becomes an attached identity. And after a while, it should get old, but if it doesn't, it isn't what the texts are talking about. And in fact, I can't share them tonight, but there's actually wonderful narratives in here where the monks did, in fact, take this down a road like that and ended up going down a wrong path, and the Buddha had to scold and exhort them to come back from that kind of misreading of decay as a permanent kind of, because then their minds lost traction to cultivate and they just sort of yielded to it. And so it's sort of like, and so you yield to the decaying nature of things and you just sort of let go. And it becomes a kind of false release. It's not real liberation. Yeah, it takes some attunement to stay between these. But usually you use them as knot untiers. If you're too attached, then you use this to break that. But if you get into that, then you would use something else to break you out of that. But it's a setting up. And so that's why I was trying to bring, you can set up on one of the four or a couple of the four, but either way you set up, it's still an identity and a holding. Okay, I'm going to read one poem. Pass. Let me see. This poem is not very long. But for me, it illustrates a little bit about tonight because it has to do with this idea of the self, the mark of self being one of the major marks. And this one is really at the core of the confused existence, that the self is the core of everything else. So this is from, well, a poem I like very much, Robinson Jeffers, who was an American poet. He actually lived for quite a bit of time down in Carmel. And if you ever go to Carmel, you can check out his little stone house, which is really cool. He built a stone house there when Carmel was a different kind of Carmel. And it had a tower in there, and that's where he wrote. It's really quite cool. In this point, the poem is called Carmel Point. And in the poem, he's doing something with kind of knocking us off our pedestals of homocentrism, but egocentrism as well. So I'll just read it. The extraordinary patience of things, exclamation point. This beautiful place defaced with a crop of suburban houses. How beautiful when we first beheld it. Unbroken field of poppy and lupin, walled with clean cliffs. No intrusions but 2 or 3 horses pasturing. Or a few milch cows rubbing their flanks on the outcrop rockheads. Now the spoiler comes. Does it care? What's the spoiler? Now the spoiler comes. So he's saying this pristine Carmel place, beautiful flowers, the hills, the animals, and now the spoiler comes. Does it care? Spoiler is?
Humans.
Huh?
Humans.
People, right? Developers. Not faintly does it care. It has all time. It knows the people are a tide that swells and in time will ebb, and all their works dissolve. Meanwhile, the image of the pristine beauty lives in the very grain of the granite, safe as the endless ocean that climbs our cliff. As for us, we must uncenter our minds from ourselves. I love that line. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and the ocean that we were made from. Lovely poem, but this line is very Buddhist. We must uncenter our minds from ourselves. That is meditation. We must unhumanize our views. And by humanize, it doesn't mean become cold and inhumane. It means not so ego-homocentric. And remember that who we are is made up of the granite, the rocks, the ocean, the elements, and so forth, and not locate this small little self. So, Carmel Point by Robinson Jeffers. Like it. Okay, questions? Announcements. You got China last week?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back.
You should have said dui or sure, not
Dui.
yup.
Sure. Yes. So tomorrow we have Alatamsaka Sutra lecture, 7:30 p.m. by Rev. Heng Shure. And all the classes go as usual. You can find more information on our website, berkeleymonastery.org. And every day we have meditation in the morning, 6:15 to 7:15, afternoon 5:15 to 6:15 p.m. So welcome. Everything for free. And
Well, yes, but then everything has a price too. If you come and meditate and really do it, you will pay for it. I think we'll do the transference in English. Living, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May His boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are